The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she was about to press play on a recording that could collapse an empire. The air in the studio felt heavier than stone. Lights glaring like interrogation bulbs, every breath amplified in the tense silence. Melania Trump sat poised, hands clasped tight, her trademark serenity cracking under the weight of what was coming. AOC's fingers brushed against the small black USB drive, tiny, unassuming, yet powerful enough to unravel decades of carefully guarded secrets. "This isn't about politics anymore," she said, her voice steady as steel. "This is about truth and whether it still matters." In that instant, millions watching from living rooms to airport lounges leaned forward, unaware they were seconds away from witnessing the unthinkable. A former First Lady's carefully curated legacy shattered on live television. This is a dramatized story, but its stakes, its questions, and the raw emotion it unleashes, those are as real as the power games playing out in the highest halls of politics. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she was about to press play on a file that could collapse an empire. The studio air was unnaturally still, like the last breath before a thunderstorm. The glow of overhead lights wasn't warm, it was sharp, clinical, cutting across the faces of the panelists seated around a sleek black table. The red, live indicator blinked like a silent heartbeat, steady and merciless, reminding everyone in the room and millions beyond that every word, every breath, every flicker of expression was now a matter of public record. Melania Trump sat third from the right, her posture flawless as ever, hands folded neatly in her lap, dressed in a crisp white blazer that seemed designed to repel any stain, metaphorical or otherwise. She was the embodiment of composure, but anyone watching closely could see the faint tension at the corners of her mouth, the way her fingers occasionally flexed against her thigh as though rehearsing an escape. Across from her, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat equally still, yet her presence felt electric. She wore a charcoal blazer over a simple black blouse, her hair pulled back tight, eyes fixed straight ahead, not on Melania, not on the cameras, but on the small black USB drive that lay on the table like a sleeping predator. It was tiny, almost laughably so, but there was something in the way it caught the light, something about its quiet existence in the sterile environment of the studio that suggested it was anything but harmless. The host, a veteran broadcaster with decades of polished neutrality, shuffled his cue cards nervously. He wasn't used to this kind of silence, the kind that felt alive, as if the room itself was waiting for something to snap. The first 20 minutes of the broadcast had been routine. Questions about policy, sound bites about unity, even a light joke or two. But now, as the topic shifted toward political ethics and accountability, an invisible weight settled over the table. Viewers at home likely felt it too, though they couldn't know why yet. AOC's fingers brushed the USB gently, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the temperature of a coiled snake. Her mind replayed the last 48 hours in flashes, the whispered phone calls, the sleepless nights scanning decades-old financial records, the warning texts from anonymous numbers telling her to back off while you still can. She could still hear Kenny's voice from that final meeting before the show. "Alex, if you do this live, there's no undo button, no spin control. They will come for you." And her answer, calm but laced with steel, "They've always come for women who tell the truth. I'm not special, but maybe this moment can be." She could feel a low thrum of anxiety beneath her ribs, but she'd learned years ago how to tame it, how to let it sharpen her instead of shake her. Melania tilted her head slightly, catching the movement of AOC's hand. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, enough for an unspoken message to pass between them. Melania's was a warning, icy and refined, the look of someone accustomed to having doors opened and questions deferred. AOC's was something else entirely, a quiet, unflinching resolve that said, "You know what's coming, and so do I." Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer gestured frantically at the host to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but the man was too rattled. He cleared his throat and glanced at his notes, but even his polished demeanor couldn't mask the creeping dread of the unknown. The audience at home didn't yet understand, but they would. They would understand why a former First Lady's smile was beginning to falter, and why a congresswoman from the Bronx had come to this table with more than just opinions. Outside the studio, the world was oblivious to the storm building within these walls. Traffic in Midtown Manhattan moved as usual. Screens in airports displayed the live feed as background noise. Families sat down to dinner with the TV playing in the corner. None of them yet knew they were minutes away from seeing history fracture, live on air. AOC's thumb tapped once against the USB, a subtle but deliberate gesture. She didn't need theatrics. The evidence would speak louder than any performance. She took in a slow breath, her voice low, but carrying as she finally broke the silence. "Since we're talking about ethics," she began, "let's not pretend immunity comes with a last name." The words hung in the air like smoke. Melania's gaze hardened, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no sound came. The host fumbled for a segue, his voice catching as he tried to regain control. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, are you implying—" AOC didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "I'm not implying," she said. "I'm stating, and I'm prepared to back it up." Her hand closed over the USB drive. The camera caught every detail, the subtle tightening of Melania's jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the slight tremor in her right hand as she adjusted her blazer. The audience watching couldn't turn away now. They sensed instinctively that something irreversible was about to happen. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, harsher, as if even the inanimate objects in the room felt the shift. Somewhere deep in the control room, a young assistant whispered, Are we still live?" No one answered. This is a dramatized account, but the fear in their eyes, the tension in their voices, the electric anticipation of a truth long buried, clawing its way to the surface, those are real. Because in every hall of power there are names you're not supposed to say and questions you're not supposed to ask. AOC was about to ask them anyway. The host was mid-sentence, carefully navigating the ever-purposeless terrain of political ethics, his tone smooth, his hands clasped tightly on the stack of cue cards. But there was a current under his words, a rising awareness that the atmosphere in the studio was changing. The first 20 minutes had been predictably safe, sound bites traded like poker chips, polite applause from the studio audience on cue. But now there was an almost imperceptible shift as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the small black USB drive like a chess player preparing to sacrifice her queen. "Since we're talking ethics," AOC said, her voice low yet slicing through the ambient hum of cameras and lights, "let's not pretend anyone is exempt, not even former First Ladies." For a moment, the words seemed to hang suspended in the heavy air, as if time itself had faltered. Melania Trump blinked once, her polished exterior betraying the faintest ripple, the kind of micro-expression that only seasoned watchers would catch. Then, almost imperceptibly, she adjusted the pristine cuff of her sleeve, lifting her chin slightly, her smile sharpening like a blade. "Excuse me?" The words were calm, carefully measured, but there was a coldness underneath, a defensive edge in the vowels that hadn't been there before. AOC didn't break eye contact. She reached for the USB drive, her movement unhurried, almost casual in its precision. There was no dramatic flourish, no raised voice, no accusatory finger, just a quiet certainty that seemed to press down on every person in the room. The host shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between the two women, as though searching for a safe harbor in a rising storm. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez," he began, but his voice faltered as AOC slid the USB into the port of the studio's main monitor. The screen at the center of the set flickered, the house lights dimming slightly as the feed shifted from the network's default backdrop to a stark black screen. Then, in bold white letters, it appeared. "Syracuse Case 2011, Sealed Records." Gasps rippled faintly from the edges of the audience. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer hissed into his headset, "What the hell is she doing?" Another voice replied, urgent and clipped, "Stay with it. Don't cut the feed. Not yet." Melania's hands, still folded elegantly in her lap, tightened imperceptibly. Her smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes, which now flicked briefly to the host before returning to AOC with an unmistakable warning. "This is outrageous," Melania said smoothly, her accent wrapping around the syllables like silk hiding steel. "I don't know what this is, but it is clearly an attempt to smear my name on live television." AOC turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words, but her eyes didn't leave the glowing screen. "It's not a smear if it's documented," she replied, her voice steady, almost too calm. "What you're about to see isn't conjecture, it's court filings, financial transfers, and a pattern of behavior that demands answers." The host's fingers drummed nervously against his cue cards. He looked to the control room for guidance, but all he saw were frantic hands waving and mouths moving in soundless panic behind the glass. The room felt like it was holding its breath. The studio light seemed hotter now, casting sharp shadows across faces that had been carefully trained to maintain composure. Viewers at home didn't know yet what was in the Syracuse files, but they could sense it. Something was about to break open. Melania's PR assistant, seated just out of frame, shifted uncomfortably, her phone buzzing incessantly in her lap. The host tried again, voice tight. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, are you accusing Mrs. Trump of wrongdoing? On this broadcast?" AOC's gaze finally shifted to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm saying the American people deserve to know whether the person sitting across from me has ever been held accountable for her involvement in offshore financial structures tied to shell companies and questionable real estate transactions during a critical period in U.S. political history." The word accountable seemed to echo off the studio walls. On the screen, folders opened one by one. PDFs of wire transfers, corporate filings from Delaware and the British Virgin Islands, a grainy scan of a sealed affidavit with only key names blacked out. AOC didn't gesture to them, didn't narrate. She simply let the evidence breathe, the silence amplifying each new revelation as it appeared. Melania's breathing, almost imperceptible before, now moved visibly in her chest. She straightened slightly, her voice still calm but underpinned with a tension she could no longer hide. "This is political theater," she said. "It's beneath even you, Congresswoman." AOC didn't flinch. "Then you should welcome an investigation," she replied. There was no raised pitch, no dramatics, just 5 words, delivered with such surgical precision they felt like a scalpel sliding beneath armor. In the control room, an assistant whispered, "We're trending already. Twitter's blowing up." The senior producer cursed under his breath. "Do not cut to commercial. This is the show now." AOC's hand hovered briefly over the laptop's touchpad as she prepared to play a video file labeled Key Testimony, Lydia Corchi, 2011. The host looked as if he might faint. Let's all take a breath," he stammered, but the audience knew there would be no breathing until this was over. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, social media ablaze with hashtags, hashtag AOCV's Melania, hashtag the receipts, hashtag truth on air. In that moment, time seemed to dilate, and every eye in the room, every lens, every unseen watcher felt the gravitational pull of the truth clawing its way toward the surface. This wasn't just a segment anymore. It was a reckoning. The studio was no longer just a room with cameras. It had become the epicenter of a political earthquake, radiating out to every television, every phone, every social feed across the country. As the screen behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez continued cycling through the sealed documents, hashtags began exploding across platforms. Hashtag AOC exposes, hashtag truth on air, all trending globally within minutes. Twitter feeds refreshed at lightning speed as viewers clipped and shared the moment AOC calmly inserted the USB and revealed the Syracuse case 2011. Clips were spreading with captions like, "Oh, just changed everything," and "Live TV will never be the same again." In the control room, producers were visibly panicking, their headsets filled with overlapping voices from network executives demanding answers. "Pull the feed now," one shouted, only to be countered by another yelling, "We're breaking records, let it ride." The host, who moments earlier had been the picture of professional composure, was now visibly flustered, his collar damp, his hands shuffling cue cards that no longer held relevance. He tried to intervene, his voice tight, the veneer of control cracking. "Ms. Ocasio-Cortez," he said with forced calm, "are you accusing Mrs. Trump of financial misconduct on live television?" The question hung heavy in the air, cameras tightening on AOC's face, her expression unreadable but her eyes alive with a fierce clarity that made millions lean closer to their screens. She didn't hesitate. "I'm saying the pattern demands answers," she replied evenly, her voice low yet carrying unmistakable authority. "And silence isn't an answer." For a split second, the studio was dead quiet. Then Melania Trump shifted in her seat, her perfectly applied smile now looking more like a mask about to crack. "This is absurd," she said, her tone still smooth but threaded with tension. "These are unverified documents. This entire spectacle is nothing but a desperate attempt for attention." Her fingers twitched against the armrest, a barely controlled tell that the cameras didn't miss. Behind the scenes, the control room's energy was chaos incarnate. Screens showed real-time viewer analytics skyrocketing, social media mentions climbing by hundreds of thousands per second. "We just passed 10 million live viewers," an assistant whispered hoarsely. "This is the highest engagement since the election debates." One producer slammed a fist on the console. "Get legal on the line, now." AOC didn't so much as blink at Melania's dismissal. Instead, she shifted her gaze directly to the main camera lens, a deliberate, surgical move that seemed to pierce through every screen watching. "This isn't about spectacle. This isn't about partisanship. This is about accountability," she said, her voice calm but edged with a steel that cut through the noise. "And every American watching deserves to know why sealed cases involving a former First Lady's name were quietly buried without investigation." The reaction online was instant and visceral. Influencers, journalists, and even former political staffers began weighing in live, some praising AOC's courage, others accusing her of launching a witch hunt. Memes flooded Instagram and TikTok, the image of AOC calmly sliding the USB into the studio's monitor, already being re-edited with captions like, "When she's got the receipts," and "Silence equals complicity." Meanwhile, Melania's team scrambled off camera, her PR advisor mouthing frantic instructions as texts flew between staffers and legal counsel. The host attempted one last time to wrest control, his voice rising slightly. "We have to remember this is live television, Congresswoman. Are you prepared for the repercussions of making such claims without substantiated—" But AOC's calm interrupted him like a blade through paper. "The repercussions are why these patterns keep repeating. Power counts on silence. I'm not here to be silent." The audience in the studio didn't move. Viewers around the world didn't blink. Phones buzzed in living rooms, notifications piling up as the viral moment grew bigger than anyone in the room had anticipated. News outlets were already drafting breaking headlines. On CNN's ticker, AOC challenges Melania Trump on live TV, sealed records revealed. On Fox, AOC's reckless accusations spark firestorm. In that moment, something unspoken passed between AOC and Melania. One a congresswoman with nothing to lose, the other a former First Lady whose carefully curated image was fracturing under the heat of scrutiny. The game had shifted, the lines were drawn, and as millions leaned forward to watch, a single thought echoed across the digital ether. This isn't just live television anymore, this is history unfolding. The night was thick with the hum of traffic below, but inside the small Bronx apartment where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat, there was only the sound of a single oscillating fan and the soft rustle of papers shifting under her hands. The walls were plastered with documents and printouts, shell company diagrams connected with red string, maps with pins marking Delaware, the British Virgin Islands, and upstate New York, scanned signatures blown up to show tiny inconsistencies. Each piece was part of a larger picture, a web of financial transactions and sealed affidavits that seemed to whisper of something carefully hidden. Her laptop screen glowed in the corner, casting a cold light over a coffee table cluttered with highlighters, open folders, and 2 empty mugs. AOC leaned forward in her chair, elbow resting on her knee, phone in hand as her thumb hovered over an encrypted email titled, "This file was never supposed to see daylight." She'd read those words a dozen times since they arrived 2 nights ago from a former IRS investigator who had vanished from the public eye years earlier. The attachment was only 12 pages long, but carried more weight than anything she'd held before. Syracuse Case, 2011. The very name sent a chill down her spine. She opened the file again, scanning line by line, as if the text might morph into something less damning if she stared long enough. Wire transfers, dates, names half redacted but familiar. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A series of small real estate purchases flipped within months, funds routed through entities in the Cayman Islands, and one recurring alias, M. Knaus. She whispered the name under her breath like a curse. Maliana's maiden name before she married into an empire. AOC rubbed her eyes and exhaled. The whole thing felt like a puzzle designed to keep outsiders confused, like a maze where every exit led to another locked door. She reached for her pen and drew another line between 2 entities on the wall chart. It wasn't just about one woman, it was about a system. "If I don't speak, who will?" she murmured. Her thoughts drifted to Lydia Korchi, the Slovenian-born accountant mentioned in the sealed affidavit. According to the file, Lydia had cooperated with investigators before disappearing without explanation. No trace, no closure. AOC's stomach nodded. It wasn't paranoia if the pattern kept repeating. She thought of Kinney's words earlier that week during a meeting in D.C., his tone hushed, almost pleading. "Alex, you're walking into a storm. They don't fight fair. You know that." She had nodded but said nothing, because there were no words that would convince him she hadn't already made her choice. Her phone buzzed with a new message, this one from a journalist friend, who'd once tried to cover foreign influence in philanthropy. "Be careful, I lost my job for less." She stared at the screen, then set the phone down without replying. Across the room, her reflection in the window looked tired, determined, and impossibly small against the sprawl of a city that never seemed to sleep. She picked up a yellow sticky note and wrote in bold letters, "Courage isn't loud, it's steady." She stuck it to the edge of her laptop, a silent promise to herself. Back at the wall, she traced the timeline again. 1998, Zurich patent filings. 2003, boutique business registrations under relatives' names. 2006, Mesknaz Holdings lawsuit, sealed under national interest. Each point connected not just to Melania, but to broader networks. Banks, law firms, silent partners. AOC's jaw tightened. She knew once she went public, there would be no going back. They would call her angry, reckless, a socialist attack dog. They'd smear her name, twist her motives, flood the airwaves with pundits questioning her mental state. It had happened before to others who dared tug at the loose threads of power, but she also knew what silence cost. The people left behind when investigations were shelved. The women like Lydia whose names faded into nothing. She wasn't willing to pay that price. Her laptop chimed. A calendar reminder. 12 hours until the round table. She let out a long breath and began organizing her files into a single folder, labeled RT Evidence. It wasn't complete, not yet airtight, but it was enough to draw blood. Enough to make silence impossible. As she closed the final window on her screen, she caught sight of herself again in the glass, the faintest flicker of resolve hardening in her eyes. Whatever came next, she would not look away. Neither would the world. The rain-slicked streets of the Bronx glistened under the pale glow of street lamps as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in the corner of a small cafe, her laptop open but untouched. Her coffee had long gone cold, yet she kept it in her hands as a prop, something to make her seem less conspicuous to anyone who might be watching. On the screen before her were files downloaded from the encrypted email sent days ago, each one heavier than the last. Corporate registration papers, wire transfers, tax filings. They all pointed to shell companies quietly moving funds through Delaware and the Virgin Islands. The names on the documents were familiar only because she had been staring at them for hours. Mesknaw's Holdings, Alaria Consulting, Blue Horizon, LLC. Companies that barely existed on paper but had handled millions in transactions during a decade when Melania Trump's public narrative painted her as nothing more than a former model turned philanthropist. The deeper AOC dug, the more tangled the web became. Each line of financial data a breadcrumb leading to darker corners. But it wasn't just the paper trail that disturbed her, it was the people, or rather, the absence of them. In one file, the name Lydia Korchi appeared repeatedly. A Slovenian-born accountant who had once cooperated with IRS investigators on a suspected laundering scheme in Syracuse. And the file noted she had provided critical testimony before vanishing from her apartment in Buffalo in June 2011. No forwarding address, no bank activity, no flight records. Her last known action, withdrawing $40 from an ATM near her home. After that, silence. AOC's stomach tightened. She scrolled through old local news clippings about Lydia's disappearance, most of them buried deep in archives, their language cautious, almost neutered. One headline read, "Missing Woman Leaves Community Puzzled." Another hinted at suicide, but there was no body, no note. Only unanswered questions. She stared at Lydia's photo for a long moment. Pale blonde hair, soft eyes, a weary smile like someone who knew more than they were supposed to. A chill ran down AOC's spine as she imagined the fear Lydia must have felt in her final days of visibility. The cafe door jingled behind her. Reflexively, AOC glanced up, catching the reflection of a man in a baseball cap in the window. He ordered a coffee, sat 2 tables away, and pulled out his phone but never looked at the screen. Instead, his eyes flicked to her every few seconds. She tensed, forcing herself to look calm as she packed her laptop and folder into her bag. The instinct to leave wasn't paranoia. She had learned to trust her gut. Outside, the night air was dense with humidity. Her sneakers squeaked against the wet pavement as she started toward her apartment. A block from her building, she noticed the parked car, black SUV, windows tinted too dark for New York legal standards. Engine off but tailpipe still warm, vapor curling into the damp air. She didn't slow her pace, but her pulse spiked. Her apartment's lobby lights were visible now, just a few steps more. As she reached for the door, her phone vibrated. Kenny's name flashed on screen. "You're being followed," he said without preamble. "There's chatter. Someone's trying to figure out what you know." AOC pressed her back against the cool metal of the door, eyes scanning the street. The SUV hadn't moved. "I saw the car," she said calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Don't go straight up. Circle around. Take the service stairs." She nodded silently, slipping into the lobby as if nothing was wrong. Upstairs in her apartment, she double-locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. Her laptop was still warm when she opened it again, the files waiting like ghosts. Lydia Corsi wasn't the only name that had disappeared. 2 other low-level employees tied to Mesnes Holdings had left the country suddenly, one to Brazil, one to Singapore. Neither had been heard from since. The IRS investigation had been labeled inactive shortly after. AOC rubbed her temple. It wasn't just about money laundering. It was about erasure. Systematic, deliberate erasure. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an anonymous number. A single text appeared: "Stop digging, not your fight." She stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. Her reflection in the laptop screen looked unfamiliar now. Harder, sharper, like someone who had already decided there was no turning back. The rain-slicked streets of the Bronx glistened under the pale glow of street lamps as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in the corner of a small cafe, her laptop open but untouched. Her coffee had long gone cold, yet she kept it in her hands as a prop, something to make her seem less conspicuous to anyone who might be watching. On the screen before her were files downloaded from the encrypted email sent days ago, each one heavier than the last. Corporate registration papers, wire transfers, tax filings, they all pointed to shell companies quietly moving funds through Delaware and the Virgin Islands. The names on the documents were familiar only because she had been staring at them for hours. Mesnes Holdings, Alaria Consulting, Blue Horizon LLC, companies that barely existed on paper, but had handled millions in transactions during a decade when Melania Trump's public narrative painted her as nothing more than a former model-turned-philanthropist. The deeper AOC dug, the more tangled the web became, each line of financial data a breadcrumb leading to darker corners. But it wasn't just the paper trail that disturbed her. It was the people, or rather, the absence of them. In one file, the name Lydia Corsi appeared repeatedly, a Slovenian-born accountant who had once cooperated with IRS investigators on a suspected laundering scheme in Syracuse. The file noted she had provided critical testimony before vanishing from her apartment in Buffalo in June 2011. No forwarding address, no bank activity, no flight records. Her last known action, withdrawing $40 from an ATM near her home. After that, silence. AOC's stomach tightened. She scrolled through old local news clippings about Lydia's disappearance, most of them buried deep in archives, their language cautious, almost neutered. One headline read, "Missing Woman Leaves Community Puzzled." Another hinted at suicide, but there was no body, no note, only unanswered questions. She stared at Lydia's photo for a long moment. Pale blonde hair, soft eyes, a weary smile like someone who knew more than they were supposed to. A chill ran down AOC's spine as she imagined the fear Lydia must have felt in her final days of visibility. The cafe door jingled behind her. Reflexively, AOC glanced up, catching the reflection of a man in a baseball cap in the window. He ordered a coffee, sat 2 tables away, and pulled out his phone but never looked at the screen. Instead, his eyes flicked to her every few seconds. She tensed, forcing herself to look calm as she packed her laptop and folder into her bag. The instinct to leave wasn't paranoia. She had learned to trust her gut. Outside, the night air was dense with humidity. Her sneakers squeaked against the wet pavement as she started toward her apartment. A block from her building, she noticed the parked car. Black SUV, windows tinted too dark for New York legal standards. Engine off, but tailpipe still warm. vapor curling into the damp air. She didn't slow her pace, but her pulse spiked. Her apartment's lobby lights were visible now, just a few steps more. As she reached for the door, her phone vibrated. Kenny's name flashed on screen. "You're being followed," he said without preamble. "There's chatter. Someone's trying to figure out what you know." AOC pressed her back against the cool metal of the door, eyes scanning the street. The SUV hadn't moved. "I saw the car," she said calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Don't go straight up. Circle around. Take the service stairs." She nodded silently, slipping into the lobby as if nothing was wrong. Upstairs in her apartment, she double-locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. Her laptop was still warm when she opened it again, the files waiting like ghosts. Lydia Corci wasn't the only name that had disappeared. 2 other low-level employees tied to Mesknau's holdings had left the country suddenly, one to Brazil, one to Singapore. Neither had been heard from since. The IRS investigation had been labeled inactive shortly after. AOC rubbed her temple. It wasn't just about money laundering, it was about erasure. Systematic, deliberate erasure. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an anonymous number. A single text appeared. "Stop digging, not your fight." She stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. Her reflection in the laptop screen looked unfamiliar now. Harder, sharper. Like someone who had already decided there was no turning back. The room was dimly lit, the only glow coming from the scattered monitors showing maps, documents, and spreadsheets layered like a digital battlefield. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood near the window, arms crossed, her reflection staring back at her through the glass. Outside, the Bronx was alive with the muted hum of traffic and the occasional wail of a distant siren, but inside, there was only the sound of Kenny pacing, his shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor in restless arc. "Alex," he said again, voice low but edged with urgency. "You don't understand. They'll destroy you, not just politically. They'll go after your family, your staff, your reputation. You think they won't twist this into a circus?" He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mix of frustration and fear. "We're talking about the Trump machine. It's not just her. It's the networks, the donors, the entire apparatus that's been protecting them for decades. Once you go live with this, there's no pulling back." AOC didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on her reflection, her jaw tight, the faint lines of exhaustion visible from weeks of late nights and endless sifting through data. In her mind, she could still hear Lydia Corci's name whispered in the shadows of the sealed documents, see the black SUV idling across from her apartment, feel the weight of the encrypted email that had changed everything. She knew Kenny wasn't exaggerating. The risks were real. The smear campaigns would be relentless. The threats more direct, more invasive. She would be labeled everything from unstable to unpatriotic, her every decision dissected under the harshest light possible. But beneath the fear was a steady, unshakable core. A voice she'd carried since her days as a bartender fighting for workers' rights, since stepping into Congress as an outsider unwanted by the establishment. "They've been destroying people for decades," she said quietly, her reflection's eyes meeting her own. "Just not the ones who needed to be held accountable." Kenny rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a heavy breath. "You think the public will care? Half the country will call it a partisan stunt. The other half will be too scared to say your name out loud." "And if no one speaks?" she countered, her voice calm but edged like tempered steel. "If we all keep waiting for someone else to take the first hit, then what? This isn't about me surviving their machine, Kenny. It's about showing people it can be challenged." He sank into a chair, his head dropping into his hands. "I just don't want to watch them grind you down." She turned from the window and walked over to the mirror hanging on the wall near her desk, her reflection now framed in the dim light of her workspace. The sticky note she'd placed there days ago was still visible, its message in bold marker. Courage isn't loud, it's steady. She whispered to herself, so softly Kenny almost didn't hear it. Tell the truth, no matter the cost. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the laptop where the folder labeled RT Evidence waited. She would take it to the studio. She would lay it out in front of millions. Not for spectacle, not for vengeance, but because silence was what power counted on. And she wasn't willing to be another name on the long list of those who had looked away. Kenny looked up, defeated but understanding now. Then we get ready, because once this starts, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. AOC nodded, her face calm, but her eyes fierce. That's the point, Kenny. Once it's out, they don't get to hide anymore. The hum of the city outside seemed louder now, as if the streets themselves sensed the storm about to break. The studio was suffocating under the weight of what had just unfolded. Every camera locked on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as she stood poised, her hands resting lightly on the stack of documents beside her. The monitor behind her flickered with scanned images of wire transfers, corporate filings, and property deeds from Delaware, the British Virgin Islands, and Syracuse. Each file stamped with dates that aligned too neatly with Melania Trump's rise in the public eye. The red live icon in the corner of the broadcast feed pulsed like a warning beacon, signaling that millions were witnessing something they were never meant to see. AOC's voice cut through the charged silence, calm yet resonant with an edge that demanded attention. These aren't theories. These are records. Transfers, registrations, and sealed affidavits that no one ever intended for the public to review. The words rippled across the room, the audience holding its collective breath, unsure whether to clap or recoil. Melania Trump, seated directly across from her, maintained her signature composure. But the veneer was beginning to show hairline fractures. She adjusted her white blazer with precise fingers, her smile tighter now, her eyes colder. "This is political theater," she said evenly, the accusation laced with practiced disdain. "It's beneath even you, Congresswoman." AOC didn't flinch. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping across the cameras as if speaking directly to every household, every viewer holding their breath on the other side of the screen. "If it's theater, then let's open the curtains and let everyone see," she replied. The studio fell silent again, save for the faint hiss of headsets in the control room where producers whispered frantically to one another. The host, sweating now, shuffled his papers, his voice trembling as he tried to regain control. "Perhaps we should," but his words faded as AOC reached over and tapped the next file on the screen. "This document," she continued, her tone surgical, "details a series of transactions from 2010 to 2014, routed through a network of companies that existed only long enough to move funds before dissolving quietly into the ether. Companies tied directly to Mrs. Trump's previous ventures in Europe and the U.S. Melania's jaw flexed almost imperceptibly, her fingers digging slightly into the armrests of her chair. She leaned forward, her voice lower, almost a hiss. "You're making a mistake. You don't know what you're inviting." AOC held her gaze, unwavering. "What I'm inviting is accountability. The public deserves to know." The studio's tension was so thick it felt tangible, like a storm cloud pressing down on everyone in the room. Viewers watching from living rooms, airport lounges, and glowing smartphone screens around the world were captivated, their fingers hovering over share buttons as they sensed they were witnessing a cultural fault line cracking wide open. Within minutes of AOC's words hitting the airwaves, social media ignited in a frenzy. Clips of her calm, pointed statements spread like wildfire across platforms. One 30-second clip in particular, her saying, "Silence protects privilege. I refuse to stay silent," was shared hundreds of thousands of times in the first hour alone. Twitter trended globally under hashtags like hashtag AOC vs Melania, hashtag the receipts, and hashtag truth exposed. On Instagram, influencers began posting reaction videos, their voices wavering between shock and awe as they replayed the moment AOC slid the folder of documents across the studio table like a weapon drawn in a duel. In the control room, producers shouted over one another, some demanding the feed be cut, others insisting they ride the ratings surge that was unlike anything the network had seen in years. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office somewhere uptown, a phone buzzed with a single ominous text message sent from an encrypted number. Shut it down, whatever it takes. Back in AOC's world, the backlash was already beginning to materialize. Her phone, muted but vibrating incessantly in her bag, lit up with a barrage of notifications. Some supportive, many laced with vitriol. Threatening emails poured in to her official inbox. One particularly chilling video attachment showed her walking to her car the previous night, filmed from across the street with the caption, "We see you." Kenny's face turned pale as he read it over her shoulder. "This is how they operate," he said grimly. First fear, then chaos, then erasure. AOC's expression didn't waver. "Then we'll give them no silence to fill." Melania's team released a hastily crafted statement, calling the segment a deliberate character assassination and warning of legal consequences. Yet even as her lawyers prepared their defense, cracks were showing in the pristine armor of her public image. Anonymous sources within former Trump circles began leaking hints to journalists, murmurs about old accounts, buried investigations they'd been sworn never to discuss. But the machine was moving faster now, beyond anyone's control. Political pundits clashed live on air. Conservative voices labeled AOC's revelations as unhinged partisan attacks, while progressive commentators hailed her as a truth-teller unafraid to torch the playbook. Amid it all, AOC herself remained silent, choosing not to post, not to tweet, not to engage, letting the evidence speak louder than any soundbite. By morning, the story dominated every major news outlet. CNN's Breaking Chyron screamed, "AOC accuses Melania Trump, sealed files revealed." MSNBC analysts dissected each document shown on air, debating their legitimacy with a gravity usually reserved for election nights. Even Fox News, though quick to denounce the segment as reckless, couldn't resist looping the clip of AOC's calm rebuke, commentators warning of the dangerous precedent of weaponizing live TV. Meanwhile, an independent investigative journalist, Farah Odom, published an in-depth exposé online titled "The Syracuse Ghost Case: What AOC Uncovered," that quickly went viral. Her reporting confirmed several key details AOC had referenced, including previously unseen court documents and testimony from former IRS staffers who corroborated the existence of an investigation into Mesknau's holdings. Screenshots of these confirmations spread like wildfire, adding fuel to a public already divided and inflamed. Melania's team doubled down, issuing a second statement late in the day. "We are exploring legal action against Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for her defamatory and baseless accusations." But even as her lawyers threatened, whispers began swirling about internal panic among Trump family advisors. AOC's office remained a fortress of controlled calm. Kenny stood at her side, reading aloud the headlines stacking up. "They're scared," he said finally. "You lit a match in a room full of gas." AOC didn't look up from her laptop as she replied. "Good. Now let's see what burns." The day ended with aerial shots of protesters gathering outside Trump Tower, their chants echoing down Fifth Avenue. Some carried signs reading, "Truth over privilege," while others simply held up printed screenshots of the Syracuse Case 2011 header in defiance. What had started as a single segment had become a full-blown reckoning, and for the first time in years, the question of accountability was no longer theoretical. It was live, it was personal, and it wasn't going away. The fallout came faster than even Kenny had predicted. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's phone vibrated relentlessly, each buzz a new message that blurred the line between outrage and threat. Some were simple, almost clinical in their malice. You should watch your back. Others dripped with venomous creativity, full of violent imagery and promises of retribution. Late at night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the glow of the screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through dozens of emails with subject lines like, "You'll regret this," and "We know where your family lives." For a moment, she let her finger hover over the delete button, but she couldn't bring herself to erase them. Not yet. Each message felt like proof, not of her failure, but of how deeply her revelations had struck at the heart of something that had long been untouchable. At the Capitol, colleagues who once greeted her warmly now offered tight, polite nods or avoided her gaze entirely. A senior representative she had admired for his principled stands whispered sharply as they passed in a hallway, "You're making enemies too fast. Choose your battles, or you won't be around to fight any of them." But AOC didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that speaking uncomfortable truths rarely earned allies in places built on quiet compromise. Still, there were moments, alone in her office after the staff had gone home, when the weight of it settled heavy on her shoulders. She could almost feel the invisible crosshairs tracing her every move. Cameras waited outside her apartment. Strangers lingered too long near her office door. And yet, every time she replayed that live broadcast in her mind, the moment she had laid the folder on the table and met Melania Trump's icy gaze, she felt no regret. There was fear, yes, but beneath it burned something stronger: resolve. Kinney had warned her this would happen. Now, with the threats stacking up and whispers of political retaliation swirling, she understood the full price of truth. And she was still willing to pay it. It wasn't just AOC under siege. The storm had reached her family. Her mother's Facebook page, once filled with photos of family gatherings and comments from church friends, was now flooded with trolls posting doctored images and vicious accusations. Anonymous accounts sent her mother private messages, calling her a failure for raising a radical socialist daughter, and threatening to release personal details if AOC didn't back down. AOC's younger brother texted her late one night, his words heavy with worry. "Mom's scared. Maybe it's time to stop." The message sat on her screen for a long time before she typed her response. "I can't." Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an old friend from her days in community organizing. The voice on the other end was gentle, but edged with concern. "Alex, you've proven your point. The whole country's talking about it. You've exposed things no one else had the courage to touch. Isn't that enough? Leave it before they destroy you." AOC closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle, feeling their weight. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I haven't proven anything if they can still hide. If I back down now, it means silence wins again. I can't be one more person who saw and walked away." Her friend sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment and fear. "Then promise me you'll at least watch your back." "I always do," AOC said quietly, though she knew it wasn't enough. 2 days later, as the air outside her office grew thick with both protesters and camera crews, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read simply, "This is real." Attached was a single photograph, a grainy but clear image of a document stamped with the insignia of a Slovenian financial regulatory agency. It listed transactions matching those in the Syracuse case files and bore a signature AOC recognized from hours of cross-referencing. Below the image was a short message. "I worked on these filings. I can't be public. But you're not wrong." Kenny's eyes widened as he read over her shoulder. This could blow the lid off everything if we can verify it. But before they could even begin to follow up, AOC's secure line rang, a number she knew belonged to a contact in the FBI. The voice on the other end was clipped and serious. "We're picking up chatter, Congresswoman. Your movements are being watched. There's credible concern for your safety. Consider scaling back public appearances until things stabilize." AOC gripped the phone tighter, staring at the photos still open on her laptop. "Are you telling me to stop?" she asked, her tone even but laced with quiet defiance. "I'm telling you to understand the risks," the agent replied. "We can assign protective detail, but even that may not be enough." She thanked him and ended the call, her reflection staring back at her from the black screen. Kenny exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're closing in, and not just with words this time." AOC looked at him, her jaw set, her eyes sharp with the clarity of someone who had already made her choice. "Then let them come. I didn't start this to walk away when it matters most." She closed the laptop with a decisive click, the sound echoing in the charged silence of the office, as outside, the noise of the crowd grew louder. The hearing room in the Capitol was oppressively silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, heavy with expectation and unspoken tension. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat straight-backed at the witness table, a neat stack of folders and a single glass of water her only companions. To her left was an empty chair, its polished wood gleaming under the harsh overhead lights, a small brass plaque reading, "Reserved for Mrs. Melania Trump." The camera feeds captured it from every angle, broadcasting the absence across the nation. Networks layered text over the live footage. "Former First Lady declines to appear." In homes, offices, and coffee shops across America, millions stared at that chair, realizing it had become more than furniture. It was a symbol. AOC felt the weight of every eye watching, both in the room and beyond. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you may proceed with your statement." She nodded, her voice steady, measured. "This chair," she began, glancing at the empty seat beside her, "represents more than one person's absence. It represents the pattern we've tolerated for too long. Those with power believing accountability is optional, that silence and status are shields." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Behind her, aides whispered nervously. AOC opened her folder and laid out the evidence piece by piece. Financial records, sworn affidavits, timelines spanning over a decade, each document amplified by the stark visual of the chair beside her, a void that seemed to grow heavier with every revelation. News anchors whispered over the live feed, some calling it a masterclass in controlled outrage, others dismissing it as a performance for the camera. But none could deny the image's power. The empty chair was already trending online. Memes proliferated. "Accountability has left the building. This is what privilege looks like." And yet AOC didn't flinch. She knew the risks of standing alone at that table, but she also knew silence wasn't an option. As AOC finished presenting her prepared evidence, a ripple of murmurs swept through the room when a staffer handed a sealed envelope to the committee chair. He opened it, brows furrowing as he scanned the contents. "It appears," he said gravely, "that we've just received additional documents relevant to these proceedings." He held up photocopies of financial ledgers, offshore account filings, and a sworn statement from a former associate of Mezkinos Holdings, all stamped with Slovenian legal insignia. The committee room erupted in overlapping voices, journalists frantically typing, cameras flashing like lightning. Outside the building, crowds gathered, their chants echoing through the marble halls. Some shouted, "Accountability now," while others carried signs accusing AOC of being a radical liar, their voices sharp with anger and distrust. The nation was splitting down the middle. Cable news ran split screens, one side playing footage of cheering supporters waving "Truth Matters" banners, the other replaying clips of angry counter-protesters calling for her resignation. In that crucible of chaos, AOC remained a pillar of stillness. She didn't respond to the barbs or the praise. Instead, She addressed the committee with unwavering clarity. "This isn't about partisanship," she said. "This is about whether we believe the rule of law applies to everyone, or only to those too small to matter." Her words ricocheted beyond the chamber, into households and headlines, igniting debates at dinner tables and on talk radio. For the first time in years, Americans were asking questions they'd long been told not to ask, and they weren't stopping. The marble corridors of the Capitol echoed faintly with the distant murmur of journalists and staffers as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked briskly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The congressional hearing had adjourned hours ago, but the tension still clung to the air like humidity before a storm. She kept her eyes forward, ignoring the reporters camped outside committee rooms, their cameras trained like watchful predators waiting for any sign of weakness. As she reached a quieter hallway, footsteps approached from behind. Deliberate, measured. She didn't turn until a voice called softly, "Congresswoman?" She recognized it immediately. Representative Mark Whitlock, a senior Republican from Ohio with a reputation for his rigid composure and even colder pragmatism, stood a few feet away. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not disdain, not mockery, but something closer to resignation. He glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot before stepping closer. "You've started something we can't stop," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper meant only for her. AOC studied him for a long moment, unsure whether this was a threat or an admission. "I didn't start it," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights and relentless determination. "It was already there. I just refused to look away." Whitlock's jaw tightened. "You don't know what's about to hit you. The donors, the lobbyists, the legal apparatus. It's bigger than you realize." "I know exactly how big it is," AOC said, her tone calm, her eyes steady. "That's why it terrifies them so much that one person didn't flinch." His eyes narrowed, searching hers for weakness, but finding none. For the first time, his carefully constructed mask cracked ever so slightly. "Do you think you've won something here? Even if she falls, they'll replace her with someone cleaner. They'll rewrite the narrative and bury you under it." AOC shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I'm not naive, Congressman, but every crack in the wall matters. And you know as well as I do, people are paying attention now. They see it. They're asking questions they weren't supposed to ask." For a fleeting moment, something softened in Whitlock's gaze. He exhaled slowly as though the weight of decades in politics pressed down on him all at once. "You're dangerous," he said finally, not as an insult, but almost as an acknowledgement. "You made them bleed." He adjusted his tie, his mask sliding back into place as footsteps echoed at the far end of the hall. "Be careful. They'll come at you from every angle now." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. AOC remained still for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the folder pressed against her chest. She wasn't sure if his words had been meant as warning or reluctant respect, but it didn't matter. The cracks in the wall were there now, spreading, splintering, and no amount of polished speeches or aggressive PR could undo what had been set in motion. As she resumed walking, her reflection in the Capitol's tall windows followed her like a silent witness to the battle ahead, her face calm, her stride steady, her resolve unshaken. The inbox notifications came in waves, each one like a small crack in a dam that had held for too long. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off weary eyes as hundreds of unread emails stacked faster than she could open them. The subject lines varied, some cryptic, others blunt. "I worked for her. I need to talk." "Hidden accounts. Delaware, Virgin Islands. I have the receipts." The surge began after her congressional testimony aired. The moment when she placed sealed records into the public eye and shattered the illusion of untouchability that had long surrounded Melania Trump. Now people were coming forward, not all at once, but in cautious trickles that became a steady stream. Some were former aides, accountants, legal clerks. Others were ordinary employees who had seen too much and said nothing, their silence bought by fear or non-disclosure agreements. One message froze AOC mid-scroll. The sender's name was blocked, the address encrypted, but the words carried a weight she could feel in her chest. I was her assistant during 20102013. She wasn't innocent. I have proof. I kept backups of internal memos, emails about rerouting funds through shell charities, even a scanned directive to destroy certain records when subpoenas came. I couldn't do it then, but I can now. Attached was a single PDF, a scan of a memo marked confidential, with Melania's signature at the bottom, instructing staff to sanitize sensitive files and restructure offshore holdings to reduce exposure. AOC leaned back, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. Kenny, standing behind her, read over her shoulder in silence. The faint hum of New York traffic below their office window was the only sound for several long seconds. "This isn't just circumstantial anymore," Kenny said finally, his voice tight. This could collapse her entire narrative." AOC didn't answer immediately. She stared at the email, imagining the weight it must have taken for that assistant to send it, knowing the risks. She had spent months fighting to open cracks in the wall of silence, and now people inside were pressing their hands through, trying to be heard. But she also knew how dangerous this was. If these documents saw the light of day, the pushback would intensify beyond anything she had faced so far. Smears, lawsuits, threats, they wouldn't just come for her anymore. They would come for every person whose name appeared on a file, every source brave enough to step forward. "We have to protect them," AOC said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "Every single one." Kenny nodded. "We'll set up encrypted lines, separate channels for incoming tips, a legal firewall for those willing to testify. But Alex," his voice lowered, "this isn't a fight anymore. It's a war." AOC's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, tired but unwavering. "Then let's make sure we win the only way that matters. With the truth." She began typing a reply to the assistant, her fingers steady on the keys. "Your courage means everything. We'll handle this carefully. You're not alone anymore." The cursor blinked at the end of her message like a quiet heartbeat in the dark, a signal that the silence she had challenged was beginning to fracture for good. The silence in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's apartment was louder than any of the voices that had shouted her down in the media. It was the kind of silence that settled in after days of relentless headlines, after phone calls from once close friends went unanswered, after her inbox filled with both threats and pleas for her to stop. She sat at her kitchen table, a half-empty mug of tea cooling beside a stack of handwritten letters that had arrived in waves since her confrontation with Melania Trump. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. But for AOC, everything felt shifted, fractured, in ways she couldn't yet name. Conservative media outlets had turned her into their nightly spectacle, talking heads spitting venom, calling her reckless, a radical liar, a danger to democracy. Editorials painted her as an unhinged opportunist, a woman so hungry for attention she would burn the whole system down to see herself on television. It seemed these black officers, men like even moderate voices, began to distance themselves, wary of being caught in the crossfire. She felt the loss of friends most acutely. People she had trusted, people who had once cheered her rise, now sent turt texts or avoided her altogether. "You're too polarizing now," one former colleague wrote, their words as sharp as any headline. "I can't be associated with this. The words lingered long after she'd deleted the message. She tried not to let it wound her, but in the stillness of the night, when there was no one left to perform strength for, it pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't shift. Yet amid the isolation and vitriol came something she hadn't expected. Letters. Thousands of them. They arrived in manila envelopes, in neat little stacks tied with string, in scrawled handwriting on lined paper and expensive stationery alike. Notes from teachers, factory workers, nurses, college students, grandmothers. Some were short, just a few words, scribbled in haste. "Thank you for saying what I couldn't," or "You reminded me why truth matters." Others were pages long, stories of small injustices endured in silence, of courage found in the echo of her defiance. One letter from a retired librarian in Michigan read, "I stayed quiet my whole life because I believed the powerful couldn't be touched. Watching you reminded me that I was wrong. Thank you for not looking away." AOC read each one. Late at night, when the noise of the day had faded, her fingers tracing the ink as if to hold the weight of every unseen voice that had reached for her. Kenny often found her like that, surrounded by letters, her face tired but illuminated by a quiet resolve. "They're coming for you harder than ever," he said one evening, his voice heavy with concern. "You've lost friends, support in the party, maybe even your chance at re-election, and yet here you are, still fighting." She looked up at him, her voice soft but certain, "Because if I stop now, then they've won. Silence wins again, and I refuse to let that be my legacy." Outside the window, the city lights flickered like distant stars, a reminder that the world was still watching. And though she felt the sting of betrayal and the chill of isolation, she also felt the warmth of countless hands she would never shake, voices she would never hear except through their words on paper. It was not a fair trade, but it was one she would make again and again, because the cost of speaking had always been high, but the cost of staying silent was higher. The night air was cool against her skin as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped out onto the narrow balcony, the sounds of the city below a muted hum that carried upward like a distant tide. She gripped the cold metal railing, her fingers curling tightly around it as she looked down at the streets flooded with people. The candlelight from the marchers flickered like thousands of fireflies moving in slow waves, their signs bobbing above the crowd with messages painted in bold strokes. "Truth matters, no one above accountability. Silence ends here." She watched in silence, the glow of the candles reflecting faintly in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a deep, steady breath. This wasn't what she had imagined when she took her first oath of office. She never wanted to be the face of a movement, or the name whispered in conversations about courage. She only wanted to ask the questions too many had been afraid to ask, and speak the truths too many had buried to protect the comfortable lie of normalcy. But here she was, standing alone above a river of people who had found their own voices in the cracks her fight had created. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the heavy weight of responsibility that came with awakening a nation that now demanded more than soundbites and slogans. Behind her, the faint glow of her apartment cast a rectangle of warm light, her desk still cluttered with open files and handwritten letters sent by strangers whose lives she'd unknowingly touched. They didn't see her exhaustion, the sleepless nights, the lingering fear that one wrong step might undo it all. But perhaps they didn't need to. Perhaps all they needed was to know that someone, even one person, had been willing to face the machine and refuse to be silent. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, another message no doubt carrying the weight of either gratitude or warning. She ignored it, her eyes fixed on the crowd. Their voices carried upward in a low, unified chant that seemed to vibrate through the air like a living heartbeat. For a brief moment, AOC closed her eyes and whispered words that had become her anchor, her shield, her quiet rebellion against fear. Courage isn't loud, it's steady. She opened her eyes again, her gaze hardening not with anger but with resolve. This was not the legacy she had asked for, but it was the one she now carried, and as long as the candles burned below her, as long as their voices echoed through the streets, she knew she could not, would not, turn away. The capital was buzzing in a way it hadn't for years, a low hum of urgency that spread through committee rooms and hallways like electricity. For weeks, the fallout from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's revelations had dominated every headline, but now the energy had shifted from scandal to action. Draft proposals for a financial transparency bill circulated among lawmakers, the language bold and uncompromising. It called for mandatory disclosure of all offshore holdings for public officials and their spouses, harsher penalties for concealing assets, and expanded whistleblower protections. Some dismissed it as performative, but others saw it as a direct response to the cultural rupture AOC had created. In the chamber, heated debates unfolded. Senior legislators spoke in hushed tones about the need to restore public trust, while younger progressives invoked AOC's name directly, citing her courage as a catalyst for systemic change. Meanwhile, far beyond the marble walls of Washington, her story had taken on a life of its own. Grassroots organizations across the country began using her image, head held high, eyes fierce, as a symbol in their campaigns for accountability. Posters with her words, "Silence protects privilege, I refuse to stay silent," appeared in union halls, college campuses, and community centers. Local activists hosted teach-ins titled "The Courage to Confront Power: Lessons from AOC." Even internationally, her stand inspired similar movements. In Europe and Latin America, journalists and organizers began citing her actions as proof that individuals could still shake entrenched systems. Kenny watched from the corner of her office as AOC scrolled through images of protests in cities she'd never visited, her face on banners carried by strangers who now saw her as their voice. "You didn't just start a conversation," he said quietly. "You started a reckoning." But AOC only shook her head, her voice calm yet unyielding. "It's not about me. It never was. It's about people realizing they've been told for too long that they can't fight back. Now they know they can." The emails and letters kept coming, stories of ordinary people confronting injustices in their own communities because her stand had reminded them of their own power. The ripples were spreading faster than anyone could have predicted, and even those who once doubted her were now forced to acknowledge the undeniable shift. For the first time in years, it felt like accountability was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach. The night was quiet in her office except for the soft tapping of keys as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez scrolled through the latest flood of messages. Most were familiar now: thank you notes, words of solidarity, stories from strangers about the small acts of courage they had found in themselves. But one email caught her attention. The subject line was plain: "I want to be like you." She clicked it open and read slowly. It was from a college freshman in Ohio, a political science major who had watched every second of the congressional hearings and the viral clips that followed. "I've never believed I could make a difference before. I don't come from a powerful family. I don't have connections. But watching you stand there, steady, fearless, even when they tried to break you, I want to be that. I want to fight for what's right. How do I start?" AOC leaned back in her chair, staring at the glowing words. She remembered her own younger self, working late nights in restaurants, watching the world feel impossibly big and unmovable, wondering if one voice could ever matter. She smiled faintly, fingers poised over the keyboard. Her reply was deliberate, each word chosen like a seed meant to take root. "Don't be like me. Be better. Start sooner. Remember that courage isn't built overnight. It's built in quiet choices, in showing up when it's uncomfortable, in asking questions others are afraid to ask. You don't need permission to begin." Start now. Small or big, it counts. She hesitated, then added one final line. And when the world tells you to sit down, stand taller. She hit send and watched the screen fade back to her inbox. Around her, the office was still, but she could almost feel the hum of something larger moving through the world. Young people reading, questioning, organizing, daring to dream bigger because someone had reminded them that power could be challenged. Passing the torch wasn't dramatic or loud, it was quiet, steady, like lighting candles one by one in a room that had been dark for too long. And as she sat there alone with her thoughts, she understood that whatever storms still lay ahead, this was the legacy that mattered most.